Hello there students, welcome back to yet another lecture of Barriers to Effective Communication. This is your instructor Dhruvi Bhatt. We already talked about intrapersonal and interpersonal barriers in the previous video lecture. Intrapersonal barriers are the barriers due to a person's own attitude, personality, cultural background, etc. While interpersonal barriers are due to the sender and the receiver themselves, due to their lack of vocabulary, due to their limited knowledge, due to the communication phase they are in. Today we would be understanding the last type of barrier of communication, which are organizational barriers. Let us move further and understand that what is organizational barrier and which are they. As organizations are growing in size and the number of employees are increasing, and even the culture of all the employees are differing, organizational communication is becoming more and more difficult. There are many organizational barriers which create chaos in the organizations. Which are those? First and foremost, too many transfer stations. If for communication you use many of the mediators, it would lead to miscommunication. All of you would have played the game of telephone, right, when you were little. It is also known as Chinese whisper somewhere. So this game teaches us that if number of transfer stations increases, the communication changes from the sender to receiver. Okay, it doesn't get transferred as it is intended to. Here he is trying to tell that Mary had 2 white cats, but it is transferred as Mary had 2 black dogs. This is what happens when there are too many transfer stations in organizations. When you have to follow the chain of command in the organizations, if you want to communicate with someone in the top management as a lower level person, you might not be able to do so directly. You might have to communicate with people in between who will talk to top management. Problem only is that the communication will go wayward. I'll give you an example. Suppose I am going on leave for 2 days. I ask some student that can you please communicate to Jay that I'll sign his report after 2 or 3 days because I am going out of town for 3 days. Okay. I told it to student X. Student X thought that okay, Jay is not in my class, I'll tell to someone who is in his class. He told to student Y that please communicate to Jay that project will be signed after some days because ma'am is going out of station. Now we have 4 people involved in this communication. Y actually told Jay that get your report signed today as ma'am is going out of station after 3 days. Okay, so this is what happens when too many transfer stations are involved. Make sure that you try to lessen the number of transfer stations to make sure communication effectively takes place in any organization. The next problem is fear of superiors. Yes, many of the employees are in awe or fear of their superiors and they do not communicate correctly or frankly in fear of their bosses. This leads to incomplete, inefficient communication. They do not want to go against the ideologies or ideas of their superiors and they do not want to talk something which is not in favor of their superiors, which leads to miscommunication, incorrect communication and the employees' viewpoints not being correctly portrayed. But what to do? Our job is in his hands, right? So it's okay, but this too is a barrier. One more barrier is negative tendencies. If a person is constantly targeted and his spirits are downlifted by other people in the organization, this may lead to miscommunication. Also, there is a possibility of work groups in any organization due to informal communication between these groups or due to some specific purpose like for a specific project, for a specific client, etc. These work groups would think other groups as being outsiders and they would have a negative tendency towards them, and that is why communication will affect. Though the viewpoints of other group would be right, but they have a negative tendency and a negative environment frolicking through. One more thing which leads to organizational barrier is use of inappropriate media. Different mediums are used for communication in organizations like teleconferencing, video conferencing, telephones, Skype, messages, etc. You must know what type of media to use and when. If you are giving out a presentation, obviously you would be using a conference room. If there is some confidential message to be transferred, it is better not to do on a phone. It is better if you meet the person and convey the message. Also, some of the communications must be transferred only as written communication for future references. Make sure you use the correct medium of communication for correct things in an organization for effective communication. The last type of organizational barrier is information overload. Too much information is too difficult to manage and remember by all the employees, and this leads to the information being mismanaged and the information gets lost. This leads to miscommunication or ineffective communication. Make sure that you keep a proper track of information. Make sure that there is a proper repository which has all this information stored so that employees do not have this overload or burden of information in their heads. Otherwise, information will go mismanaged. Lastly, I would like to give you some of the tips for effective communication. First is, do not communicate when you are emotionally disturbed. I told you the best is not to talk when you are emotionally disturbed. Okay. When you are emotionally disturbed, instead of leading to a miscommunication or instead of speaking some things which you don't mean, better is stay quiet. Secondly, select the most suitable medium of communication. Thirdly, use appropriate non-verbal cues. Make sure your words and actions are in sync and they complement each other instead of opposing each other. Next thing, make sure you always keep your receiver in mind. Do not make wrong assumptions about the knowledge of the receiver. Keep your receiver in mind. Keep his or her language, his or her educational background, cultural variations in mind before communicating with the person. One more thing, be aware of the cultural diversity and languages and respect all the cultures. Okay. Respect all the cultures, make sure that you know these cultures, make sure that you know how to behave and how not to behave with a person belonging to a particular culture. Create an open communication environment. As a boss or as a leader, make sure that your juniors are not afraid of you. Create an environment where everyone is free to speak and can speak without any stereotypes or judgments. Moving forward, analyze the feedback. If there is problem in communication, take proper feedback from the receivers, analyze the feedback, and next time make sure the problem doesn't happen. Last but not the least, avoid having too many transfer stations. Do not have too many transfer stations. Communicate more directly instead of indirectly. Moving forward, I like to give you some of the examples. I'll give you a second to think about which type of barrier this is. Otherwise, I'm always there to solve the answer for you. Here our friend finds it too tedious to work manually on the student records. But at the same time he is thinking that I cannot trust the computers but because they may corrupt the data. Which type of barrier is this? Think about it. Want a hint? It is one of the intrapersonal barriers. Now, okay students, it is blocked categories. Here the person is having a negative tendency or a stereotype towards computers, and that is why the person is not ready to trust computers. This is what is the problem is. Okay. In our second example, here the teacher asked the students that, students, where is the report I told you to submit me within the fortnight? The students told, sir, you told us to submit it bi-monthly. The students thought that they have to submit the report after 2 months. But actually the teacher meant that they had to submit the report twice every month. Which is this barrier? This again is one of the barriers from the intrapersonal barriers list. Okay, which one is it? Think about it. Fair. This is varied perceptions. The same word bi-monthly was perceived differently by the teacher and by the students. Both were correct, and it led to miscommunication or ineffective communication. Third example is where the boss is asking, where is the sales report which I asked you to submit me, Rita? Rita says, I do not remember that you asked me for any of the sales report. Okay, which type of barrier is this? I think this must be one of the interpersonal barriers. Which one is that? Okay, it is poor listening. Our Rita has very poor listening and it led to miscommunication. Okay students, that was all from my side. Thank you so much for such patiently listening to me, students. I hope that I helped you overcome some of the barriers of communication. Until next time, this is Dhruvi Bhatt signing off. Bye-bye.